Imagine a system where admitting a mistake might cost you absolutely everything, but fighting for what's fair, well, that feels like battling shadows inside the very place you work.
Hmm.
In, let's call it Victoria, Hong Kong, a police officer hit some serious financial trouble. And that kicked off a disciplinary process that, well, ended up questioning some really big ideas about justice and, individual rights.
Yeah, it's a fascinating setup.
Welcome to the deep dive. We know you don't have time to wade through stacks of documents, so we've done the heavy lifting. We've dug into a really interesting legal case specifically, a judgment from Hong Kong's top court.
And we're here to give you the essence, the core story, and maybe some surprising takeaways. This isn't just dry legal stuff. It's about real people, real rules, and how they clash.
Exactly. Think of us as your guides. We're here to cut through the noise, pull out the key bits, and hopefully give you a few of those aha moments.
Right, so you walk away feeling like you really get it.
So today's mission. We're unpacking this conflict between an officer's right to a fair hearing and the rules that seem to block that right. What does this whole situation tell us about, the balance between big institutions and the people within them?
Our main source is the court judgment itself. It lays out the facts, the arguments, the court's thinking. It's all in there.
Okay, let's get into the story. How did it all start?
It starts with a police officer. Let's call him Officer Zhang. Now, the court records show he had a good, solid service record before all this happened. Seemed like a dependable officer.
Okay, standard career path then. But then things took a turn.
Yeah, a pretty major turn financially. Officer Zhang got involved in stock market trading, like a lot of people do, but didn't go well. He ended up with really significant debts.
How significant are we talking?
Well, the judgment mentions losses adding up to nearly $500,000 Hong Kong dollars, HK $487,127.80, to be precise.
Wow, and what was his salary like then?
Around HK $22,210 a month. So you can see that level of debt compared to his income. It paints a pretty stark picture. Overwhelming debt.
Right, and that triggered disciplinary action because of the debt itself.
Exactly. He was charged under a specific internal rule, Police General Order Section 6018. Basically, he said officers had to manage their finances carefully,
Okay.
and that getting into serious financial trouble through, let's say, mismanagement, especially if it could affect your work, would lead to disciplinary action. It's about maintaining integrity.
Makes sense for a police force. So they had a hearing about this charge.
They did. Actually, there were two hearings, which is important. The first one was back in March 2001.
And what happened there?
He was found guilty initially, but, and this is key, that finding was later thrown out.
Thrown out. Why?
Procedural problems. Basically, they didn't follow the right steps in how the hearing was run, so it didn't stick. Shows how important getting the process right is, even internally.
Okay, so round one goes away on a technicality, essentially. What about the second hearing?
The second hearing was scheduled for December 2001. And this is where things get really complicated regarding fairness.
How so?
Well, the officer who had helped represent Zhang in the first hearing wasn't available this time.
Right.
They offered him a different officer as a replacement. But Zhang, understandably perhaps, having already been through one flawed process, he didn't feel confident. He'd sort of lost trust in relying on another internal colleague.
Okay, so he's feeling uneasy about his representation options. What did he want to do instead?
He asked for permission to hire his own lawyer.
Makes sense, given the stakes, his career, his future.
Absolutely. He felt the situation was serious enough, complex enough, that he needed proper legal expertise to present his side effectively.
But that request was denied.
It was. Flat out denied. And the denial wasn't arbitrary. It was based on specific police regulations that were in place at the time.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Let's dig into those regulations. They seem central to this whole thing. What exactly did they say?
There were police discipline regulations, 911 and 912. Regulation 911 said, okay, you can be defended by another police officer. Even if that other officer happened to be legally qualified, they'd be acting just as a fellow officer, not, as your lawyer in a professional sense.
So help from within the ranks was allowed?
Yes. But then Regulation 912 slammed the door shut. It explicitly said, apart from that limited help from another officer, forget it, a barrister or a solicitor. Not allowed. They couldn't appear on behalf of the officer in these hearings.
So a clear blanket ban on external lawyers.
Pretty much. A firm barrier.
So Officer Zhang was stuck. His first choice wasn't available. He didn't trust the replacement. And the rule said no lawyers. He had to represent himself then.
That's what happened. Despite asking, he had to go it alone in that second critical hearing.
And the outcome this time?
Unfortunately for him, same outcome. Found guilty again.
And the punishment?
The punishment decided was forced retirement with deferred benefits.
Ouch. What does deferred benefits mean exactly?
It meant he was out of his job, but he wouldn't get his pension payments until he reached the normal retirement age. So a huge financial hit, on top of losing his career. Initially, they suspended the retirement, but later that was reversed, and he was forced out immediately in October 2002.
So a really severe consequence. Facing that, what did he do? He didn't just accept it?
No, he turned to the courts. He tried to challenge the finding in the dismissal using a process called judicial review.
Right. Can you briefly explain what judicial review is for anyone listening who might not be familiar?
Sure. Judicial review is basically where the courts look at decisions made by public bodies like the police disciplinary tribunal here to make sure they acted legally within their powers and followed fair procedures.
So he was arguing the whole process, especially denying him a lawyer, was unlawful.
That was the core of it, yes.
And this wasn't a quick legal fight, I gather.
Not at all. It was a long road.
Yeah.
He first applied for judicial review way back in January 2003. He went to the High Court.
Oh.
They dismissed his application in August 2005.
So setback number one.
Right. He didn't give up. He appealed to the Court of Appeal.
And they saw it differently.
Nope. They also dismissed his appeal in November 2007. So, yeah, a long, probably very stressful and expensive process for him.
He kept going, all the way to the top court.
He did. He took his case to the Court of Final Appeal, the highest court in Hong Kong. And this is where the argument really focused in on fundamental rights.
The human rights angle.
Exactly. The absolute core of his final appeal was that the rule banning lawyers violated his basic right to a fair hearing. This right is protected under Article 10 of the Hong Kong Bill of Rights.
And the Bill of Rights is a big deal in Hong Kong's legal system.
Absolutely. It guarantees fundamental rights and freedoms. And as the court itself pointed out, this right to a fair hearing isn't just a local thing.
No.
No, it's a pretty universal principle in international human rights law. The judgment notes that Hong Kong's Article 10 is basically the same as Article 14.1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Which lots of countries have signed up to.
Right. And it's also very similar to Article 6.1 of the European Convention on Human Rights. They all say essentially the same thing. When your rights and obligations are being decided, you have a right to a fair public hearing by an independent court or tribunal.
Okay, that seems clear. But here's maybe a tricky bit. Does a police disciplinary hearing about someone's job and pension actually count as determining rights and obligations in that serious human rights sense? It feels a bit like an internal employment issue.
That is a really sharp question. And yes, that was a key point the court had to wrestle with.
How did they approach it?
Well, the thing is, when you're interpreting human rights treaties, you don't just look at how local law defines things like employment rights. International law often uses what's called an autonomous meaning.
Autonomous meaning.
Yeah, it means the term like rights and obligations gets interpreted in light of the treaty's overall purpose, which is protecting fundamental rights effectively. It's not strictly limited by how, say, Hong Kong domestic law might classify it, so the meaning can be broader.
I see. So even if local law sees it as just an employment dispute, human rights law might see it as affecting fundamental rights.
Exactly. Especially when things like your livelihood, your reputation, your pension are on the line. The aim is to make sure the protection offered by the treaty is real and practical.
Okay, that makes sense. So armed with that understanding, how did the Court of Final Appeal rule? Did they agree with Officer Zhang?
They did. They allowed his appeal. They overturned the lower court's decisions.
What was the crucial reasoning? Was it this autonomous meaning idea?
That was definitely part of it. They looked at how the understanding of rights and obligations has evolved, especially in international human rights law concerning employment. They specifically mentioned a big case from the European Court of Human Rights called Eskelinen v. Finland.
And what did that case establish?
Eskelinen basically set out principles for when employment disputes do fall under the fair hearing protections of Article 6 of the European Convention. Generally, unless a state can show strong reasons why access to a court should be excluded for certain categories of public servants, the right applies.
So the Hong Kong court applied similar thinking.
Yes, they recognized that what was at stake for Officer Zhang, his job, his pension, his reputation, clearly fell within the scope of rights and obligations protected by Article 10 of the Bill of Rights. His hearing was determining those rights.
Okay, so the right to a fair hearing applied. What about the police force's reasons for banning lawyers? They must have had justifications, right? Like efficiency.
Oh, absolutely. The police argued that the ban was necessary for, speed and efficiency in the disciplinary process. They also argued that people within the force had the specialist knowledge needed to handle these internal matters.
And the court's response to that?
They considered those arguments, but ultimately they found them unconvincing, at least not convincing enough to justify a complete blanket ban on legal representation.
Why not? Speed is often important.
It is, but the court basically said efficiency can't trump fundamental fairness, especially when the consequences for the officer are so severe, like losing your job and pension. They felt the potential injustice outweighed the claimed benefits of speed and internal expertise alone.
Did they look at how other places handle this?
They did. They noted that in other similar legal systems, like the UK and parts of Canada, like British Columbia, there are provisions for allowing legal representation in police disciplinary hearings, at least in certain circumstances. So it wasn't like this ban was the only way to run things.
That comparison probably weakened the police argument, I imagine.
It certainly suggested that allowing lawyers wasn't automatically incompatible with an effective disciplinary system.
Was there any mention of, like, fairness in terms of the resources available to each side? The police presenting the case versus the officer defending themselves?
Yes, the judgment briefly touched on that, using the term equality of arms.
Equality of arms.
Yeah, it's the principle that both sides in a legal proceeding should have a reasonable opportunity to present their case under conditions that don't place them at a substantial disadvantage compared to their opponent.
Right.
The court acknowledged that the prosecution in these hearings could potentially be presented by government lawyers or even experienced police officers, maybe legally trained ones. So denying the accused officer their own lawyer could create an imbalance.
A David and Goliath kind of situation, potentially.
Potentially, yes. Although the court's main reason for striking down the ban was the breach of the fundamental right to a fair hearing itself, the equality of arms point sort of reinforced the fairness concerns.
So the final decision. Officer Zhang wins his appeal at the highest court. His conviction, the forced retirement, all overturned.
That's right. A significant victory for him after a very long fight.
But what does this mean going forward? Does every police officer facing discipline now automatically get a lawyer paid for?
No, the court was clear about that. They didn't create an absolute right to legal representation in every single disciplinary case.
So what did they change?
They struck down the blanket prohibition. The key takeaway is that the old regulations, 911 and especially 912, were incompatible with the Bill of Rights because they totally banned lawyers.
Okay.
What the court established instead is that the disciplinary tribunal, the body hearing the case, must now have the discretion to allow legal representation.
Discretion, meaning case by case.
Exactly. They have to consider if legal representation is necessary for a fair hearing in that specific case. They look at things like, how serious the charge is, the complexity of the case, the potential penalty, whether there are difficult points of law involved, and the officer's own ability to present their case.
So it's a shift from never to maybe if fairness requires it?
That's a good way to put it. The tribunal now has the power, and arguably the duty, to permit legal representation when the circumstances demand it to ensure fairness.
That feels like a pretty major development for police discipline in Hong Kong. What's the bigger picture here for our listeners? Why does this case matter beyond Officer Zhang?
Well, I think it really drives home a fundamental point. Even within structured, hierarchical organizations like a police force, which obviously need rules and discipline, those rules can't override basic human rights like the right to a fair process.
Due process matters everywhere.
It does. This case highlights that constant tension, that balancing act between maintaining order and efficiency within an institution and protecting the fundamental rights of the individuals who work within it. It's a reminder that rules need to be just, not just convenient.
So let's quickly recap the main points for everyone. We had Officer Zhang facing serious debt leading to a disciplinary charge.
Right. 2 hearings, the first overturned for procedural flaws.
Then the second hearing where he was denied a lawyer because of specific regulations 911 and 912, banning external legal representation.
He represented himself, was found guilty, and faced forced retirement.
He fought back through judicial review, lost in the lower courts, but took it all the way up.
And the Court of Final Appeal agreed with him, focusing on his right to a fair hearing under the Hong Kong Bill of Rights, Article 10.
They looked at international standards, the Escalinen case, the idea of autonomous meaning for rights.
And decided the blanket ban on lawyers was incompatible with that right. They struck down the ban.
But crucially, They didn't mandate lawyers for everyone. Instead, they introduced discretion. Tribunals can allow legal representation if fairness demands it in a specific case.
Exactly. That's the core shift.
So, for you listening, the real aha moment here might be seeing how these fundamental rights principles aren't just abstract ideas. They have real power to challenge established rules, even within powerful organizations, to ensure fairness for individuals.
It's a concrete example of checks and balances in action.
It definitely raises a big question, doesn't it? When someone's facing serious consequences, job loss, reputation damage, when is having a lawyer not just helpful, but absolutely essential for a truly fair outcome?
Yeah. And how do systems, whether it's police discipline or something else, strike that right balance? The balance between running smoothly and efficiently and making sure justice is truly done for the person involved.
It's a tough one. And actually, we'd love to know what you think. Maybe jump into our discussion forum or vote in our poll on this. Should there be a guaranteed right to a lawyer in these kinds of serious disciplinary hearings, or is the court's discretionary approach allowing it when fairness demands the better way to go?
Yeah, consider both sides. What are the pros and cons? It's worth thinking about.
Because this deep dive into Officer Zhang's case really reminds us, doesn't it? Rules give us structure, sure, but it's that steady commitment to fairness, to due process, that really makes a system just.
Well said.
Maybe think about how that principle plays out in other areas you know about. Anyway, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
We'll be back next time, unpacking another complex topic to bring you the insights that matter.